We're going to be talking about dissecting big data today and trends in video consumption and behavior. I'm Adi Adiosun from Comscore. I'm going to be joined by Joe Incerello, Mike Doobie, and also Jim O'Neill. I hope I haven't butchered any of their names. The names are not that difficult. But what we're going to be talking about today, this session really is going to be interactive. So we'll have questions which I'm going to be putting forward to the panelists, getting their views. I think some of these guys obviously have been in the space for quite some time. I was speaking to Joe earlier on. I think he clearly started when he was about 6, because he's been in the industry for 28 years. But we're going to be looking at some of those, some of the trends and some of the things that we're seeing with regards to big data. At Comscore, obviously, we are in this space of kind of measuring all of these interactions and what people are doing. And interestingly enough, I was saying the other day that in the past 2 years, we talk about big data, and again, it's all relative, right? One person's big data, another person's peanuts. But in the past 2 years, this is a fact, we've collected more data than in the entire history of mankind. So that just kind of gives everyone a view of how this growth really is as it relates to big data. A couple of other numbers which are interesting is about 87% of the US population today, they view online videos. So they're, people watching videos online. And even though we're seeing some very interesting things, I'm sure you're going to hear from the panelists, some of these, the devices that are changing how things are in the space. But again, if you think about the mobile, the tablets and all the other devices we have, but a lot of people think about desktop and think, well, that's not really a huge market. But I can share with you that desktop, we've seen 60% increase in desktop consumption as it relates to video in the past 3 years. And the interesting piece, because again, most people want to know, well, where's the money, right? About 6.3 billion will be spent in 2015 in terms of ads as it relates to video. So it's clearly a very, very exciting space that we're in. And talking about that excitement, today, the announcement of Verizon acquiring AOL is another very exciting piece, which I was, earlier on when I was speaking to Jim, we touched on, how that's going to change, again, some of the business models and the opportunity for both AOL and Verizon. So I'm going to just start to my left, let Joe tell us a bit more about some of the exciting things you've been doing. I know that you've been in the bunker with HBO now and the very, very exciting things you've been doing there, but also some of your experiences just when you talk about big data. One of the interesting things, some of the things that you guys are doing within your stadium, which goes beyond just capturing video, some of the other pieces. But good to get your thoughts, and then we'll move over to Mike.
Sure, thank you. So I work for Major League Baseball Advanced Media, or we call it MLBAM, which is a little weird for people to understand exactly what we are, but we're sort of a division of baseball, if you will, that's focused on the interactive streaming space. And we started in 2000, spun off from baseball, if you will, or staked from baseball with rights on internet. And at that point in time, there wasn't a whole lot going on. The internet was cool, but people weren't really making money. Digital ticketing didn't really exist. Nobody had really streamed any video of any material size live, certainly. And in 2003, we took the step, 2002, 2003, we took the step to stream the first live baseball game on the internet. And from that has grown our very successful MLB.TV business. Along the way, as we got good at doing things online, streaming video, that type of thing, we acquired other customers, such as folks like ESPN, most recently WWE Network. As Abe mentioned, we recently launched HBO Now for those guys, and we just recently announced the PGA Tour deal that we're actually working on right now. That'll be this year as well. So we're doing a lot of streaming besides baseball, but baseball is really the kind of core of where we started our business, and probably where I'll focus a lot of my comments, our story to tell more so. on that side of it. You know, as Abe said, data is everything. You know, I think that if we all got in a time machine, we went back in time to the 50s or 60s, and we started to look at like the data that people were making business decisions with, we would probably be paralyzed by lack of information. Like, that feels right? Does that look good, et cetera? And we live right now in such a data-driven society, data-driven about, you know, what's the best recommendation of what content to watch, data-driven about quality of experience, how to improve it, how to see problems on the technical side as well as the content, and what people are looking at. There's so much data that's there that the trouble is now not capturing it. As Abe was saying, we've done a good job of actually capturing it. It's actually making it actionable that is really the key, and sort of sifting through all that signal and, you know, all that noise and looking for the signal. And so that's really what we focused our efforts on in our OTT platforms and a lot of the streaming spaces and applications. It's all kind of intertwined in that user journey and user story about what's the best way that we can service our fans and what can we provide to them to make their experience better, make them better fans, better customers, and ultimately, you know, continue to grow the next generation of baseball fan, which is the lifeblood of any sport.
That's great. Thank you.
My name is Michael Doobie. I run the streaming media practice for NPR, which is really anything that isn't traditional radio, whether it's audio or video, would run through my division at NPR. We're the largest producer of premium podcasts, I would say, in the world right now. We're in connected cars. As of this year, I think we're in about 60% of the connected cars that are getting sold. And we're looking to be at about 80 for next year. And we actually do a tremendous amount of video, even though folks might not realize that. So we do a ton of live events. You know, I would say NPR over the last few years has been quietly figuring out how we wanted to sort of increase engagement with our listeners and our customers. And I think we've seen in about 4 years now, we went from about 4 or so minutes of engagement, you know, per session. And we're looking somewhere between the 40s and the 60s, and that's minutes. So we've managed to increase that engagement time exponentially over the last few years. And so we have a really interesting way of how we've approached this. And with us, it's actually a combination of both human curation and then crunching big data. And so for us, some of you may or may not know of we have an app called NPR One, which is actually delivering a personalized media experience to each and every individual user, and it sort of takes the stuff that you seem to enjoy and tries to give you more of that, and it pays attention and it makes sure that it's trying to give you less of the stuff that you seem not to like. And so we've actually created APIs that we can make open and available to anyone, depending on the use case, to access NPR content in the same way. And so we're treating media in general, both audio and video, sort of through that same style of playlisting and curation. And so as we're neck deep in the middle of formulating an overall video plan for the entire organization. We've got a tremendous amount of content, and so we're also, I would say in the next 12 months, looking to get out to a number of distribution platforms in the OTT space to provide both an audio and a video experience on the big screen as well.
Thank you, Mike. That was incredible, from 4 minutes to 50 minutes in terms of engagement. That's pretty impressive. And at on the end, we have Jim O'Neill, who is from Leola, and I'll let Jim introduce himself. I think most people know Leola here, but
My introduction will probably be far shorter than either of these guys because I'm way used to asking questions as opposed to answering them. So, you know, that moderator role, Addy, maybe we should just change places. I have so many things I want to ask you. But, you know, Leola is in the business of helping publishers, broadcasters, and content owners deliver content to the end consumer. We do it, we help maximize revenues, maximize reach, And we were recently purchased by, and this is the best part about this, is about 6 months ago, we were purchased by Telstra, 10th largest, top 10 telecoms company in the world. And what that did was, besides putting a lot of money in our pockets, we've been pretty flush lately, it gave us reach and access to some clients that we might not have had before. It opened up a couple of markets for us. It got us into Asia, where we had not spent a whole lot of time, got us into Latin America, where we had some nascent exposure. The other thing that it did was it allowed us to go out and buy a company called Video Plaza, which is the top ad platform ad tech platform in Europe. And so it also helped establish us there, again, with some very big broadcasters that they work with. So it's a good thing to be acquired once in a while. It was very different and exciting for us all, and you know, I'm buying later. So you know, but our business is analytics. I mean, that's still our core business. We deliver everything, but analytics is what we see as our bread and butter. At NAB, we just introduced the latest iteration of our analytics platform called Leola IQ. And we think that, well, we found that when you can help users discover content, you get an uplift of up to 40 to 60% in general. And so if you can give them content that they want to see and give them more content they want to see, it's a great situation to be in. And that's all I've got.
That's great. Actually, I'm going to really kick it off there. In that space of big data, and Jim, this first piece is to you, and then we can see what other people's thoughts are. There's so much data, there's so much content for users, to get to. And if you think about some of the bigger players, whether it be Netflix or any of the other players, some of the challenges that they have is not that we don't have content, it's about how they clean it up to repurpose it. And again, that question really around how do you think about that? How do you do that? And how do you do that across different devices?
That's a great question, which is the short way to say, I'm not sure. Our deal was he wasn't going to ask me any hard questions, and he's done it already. I think a lot of it has to do with, literally we're sitting on about 8 years of data, and our data is getting deeper and deeper, and our use of that data has been very difficult because it's very hard to take the specifics, and it's difficult to ask the right questions sometimes. And so we're sitting on a lot of data that we need to filter and to decide, what are you really trying to find? And when we have that direction, it's a lot easier. I mean, we can, for instance, search and recommendation. Well, algorithms are really pretty straightforward for that. But really going beyond that is a little bit more difficult. We talked earlier about how hard it was to monetize mobile video. The biggest question on mobile video is right now analytics, but you have so much data. How can you not do things with that? I talked to TiVo a couple of weeks ago at the cable show, and they said the same thing. They've got about 10 years worth of data that they've been collecting on their TiVo boxes, and they're just starting to find a way to use that data. So it's not as clear cut as I think we'd all like it.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mike, we were talking about, when most people, when I think about NPR, I think, oh, radio. But, so we thought, well, did we bring you to the right panel? But clearly you've got a lot of video content, and you've got some big initiatives around, around video. How are you seeing the engagement of users as it relates to audio, where you've got a very captive audience? The example you gave where you're in 60% in cars today, where you've got a very captive audience, to change the model where there's video and there's a lot of video content. How are you doing that in terms of keeping those types of audiences as engaged as you would typically have someone in an audio world?
Yeah, so certainly there is a shift in sort of the user habits and consumption between audio and video. For us, we are measuring across different platforms, both web, mobile devices, and we've had a Roku app now for quite some time, which was sort of a test for us as we're getting ready to dive headfirst into the OTT world. Certainly, we're paying attention to the sort of engagement in the drop-offs and where and when folks are leaving us within that experience. And so certainly from an editorial standpoint, that does affect I wouldn't say the curation, but we actually change content from an editorial standpoint depending on what the destination is. And so depending on what we're finding in terms of engagement across different platforms and different devices, can and often does change the actual assets. So we're not just wholesaledly repurposing content across every platform. We actually do touch and massage a lot of that content as it goes out, which does create a problem sometimes in terms of the scale, in terms of how much content that we can process based on manpower, since we're actively touching a lot of that stuff. But certainly it's actually filtering back in, unlike MLB, where a lot of the content is live, and you have less, you don't really have a lot of creative control over that flow. We sort of come from the other direction where we're really about storytelling. So a lot of our pieces, whether it's audio or video, is really about telling a story. And so from that standpoint, we do have a lot of leeway to sort of look at how well certain pieces and certain styles and types of content are doing, where people are dropping off in that content, and it does filter back in onto the editorial side, because certainly we want to keep our consumers engaged, and it's very important for us to crunch through that to see what works and what doesn't.
Thank you. So multi-platform is another real area, right, as it relates to video, that consumption, the different screens. So, I mean, Joe, you will have a lot of experience with this, because obviously, you've been in the industry since you were 6.
Right.
So, what changes have you seen with these different platforms, and what are people's experience? People's expectations, as from your, based on what you see in the data, as it relates to, as they move across those different screens?
Well, I think back in the day, Betamax was not the best telemetry system that was out there. So, and there's like 5 people in the audience that actually got
can remember that. Yes, exactly.
So that's awesome. Thanks everybody. I think any way you look at the data, the problem that people run into is that the human brain, just the way that we think, wants to make generalizations. These people like this, or males 18 to 35 want to do this thing. Multi-device is just another pivot on all the other data that is pivoting themselves as well. And so the fact is that we're getting more diverse as a society. People are consuming content in many more diverse ways. So that is the type of content, that is the duration of the content, it's the device of the device of the content itself that's displayed on it, it's the personalization, it's all these things. They're all twists on it. And so they definitely coalesce around certain touch points. And then if you're really good from a content standpoint, and you're producing scripted content, for an example, you wind up intersecting a bunch of those kind of nexus points with a piece of content that a bunch of people can agree is awesome. One of our partners, like HBO with Game of Thrones, like a lot of people from a lot of very different, diverse backgrounds like that show, and they've managed to connect a bunch of those dots. But if you had to say, like, well, who watches Game of Thrones, you can't answer that question with, like, oh, well, it's males 18 to 35. Right. Baseball, for our content, sort of the same thing, even beyond itself. It's not just your favorite team, although affinity for team or location, city, things like that are very important. It's, who are you? What are you watching it on? When are you watching it? What are you trying to accomplish in that user story? So from a concept, content consumption standpoint, if I'm sitting on a 50-inch TV and I have an Apple TV hooked up to it, I'm probably going to sit back for the long haul, and then I probably want a more passive consumption sort of notion of it. If I'm carrying my mobile device and I'm checking the scores, maybe I want to see a quick highlight or I want to see something like that. Or even down into like wearables now, where you have things like that. It may be that it's a data snack. So I know you're at a ballpark because you used a digital ticket to get in. I can tell that you're in the stands and somebody just threw a sick fastball or hit a home run. When you look at your glance action, maybe that's going to tell you how fast that ball was hit or how far that home run was hit. So I think that the context of where people are consuming, combined with the demographic information, combined with the innate content, and combined with the device they're consuming it on, are kind of some of the main axes that float around there. And then the question is, can you circle a group of those that actually makes sense and then make that an actionable thing to go ahead and target that segment with the product they're looking for?
Yeah. And that's not a trivial task.
No, not at all.
Because one of the big challenges that most people have in this space is actually connecting that multi-platform user, right? Where you may, especially for people who are trying to personalize, make recommendations, right? All those types of things. And I know NPR, you mentioned, you mentioned earlier on that, one of the things that Mike and team have been doing is not just saying, well, let's just look at the data. It's still the important piece to have that human touch, that curation you spoke about. So as you really think about that, what are the best practices and challenges that you have found in trying to, strike that balance?
Well, I think first and foremost, we want to be able to give what we would traditionally call listeners, and now these days they're also viewers, we want to give them the content that they want. We want to surface that and make it easy for them to consume, and we want them to stick around. I would, for us though, our voice and the flavor of the content is very unique to NPR, and so what we didn't want to lose in that process of getting content to folks was making sure that some of the best folks in the industry that we have on the editorial side could still have sort of a voice in that delivery of content. When you've got a website, and if I go to a homepage and I have a featured article and I have some other stuff, there's a human being that's typically deciding what floats to the surface and what gets highlighted and what falls off. So for us, when we have that sort of human touch in the curation, it might be something like, for particular genres of content that we have, we'll have somebody on the editorial side that if we have a dozen stories around a particular, around entertainment or around technology or politics for that day, we'll actually have somebody that's surfacing up what we feel are the top articles, and that can change over the course of the day. So if we see stuff that's trending over the course of the day, we're making sure that that floats up. When we're, one of our main deliveries of content that most, I wouldn't say most, but many of our active consumers are using is that NPR One delivery style of content, which again it feels like a very linear delivery. You're not choosing from a playlist. It's one asset after the other. You do have the ability to indicate that you like it or that you want to skip. And so we are learning from that, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily fly in the face of that human curation for us.
Yeah. And Jim, I think one of the things you touched on earlier on, then I'll open this for the rest of the group to really give their thoughts on this, is one of the aspects of what we see is there's a lot of data, right? There's the notion of what a person, and this is still touching on what Mike touched on, which is a person deciding, somebody else deciding, or a machine deciding, well, because you've watched this is the next thing you should watch. And the whole notion of using that and auto plays, for instance, especially when it comes to short form, we see a lot of auto play, because again, put in the pivot of big data, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of ways you can look at the audience. Joe's pointed out you can't just take a brush and say, well, this is the audience, it's 18 to 34. How would you, how difficult is it to do that? And, how do you solve that? How do you solve the notion of, I'm going to give you, and this is not another of my hard questions, but how do you solve the piece around, being able to identify when is it right for you to push content to a user, right? And again, in the context of video, and when you really want those audiences to think a little bit. And let's, again, add in another pivot to it, really, which is about the screen which they're choosing. Joe talked about when you're on a bigger screen, you want to, you're kind of really, you're in that traditional TV mode, whereby you just don't want to think.
Well, let me answer that with a quick question of my own, and
Yes.
it's for you, Mike. How real time is your decision making on your content?
It's absolutely real time.
I mean, you watch it trend and.
Well, so I would say that the playlisting decisions are usually made a couple of assets in advance, but at any point that a call is made into our system to for that decision making, all of the data that it's making use of is real time.
Okay. Then one more question. How many of you guys watched are Game of Thrones fans? And I'm not really dodging your question. I'm tying this all in. And did anybody watch it on HBO Now? I did. I thought it was awesome. I watched it on my iPad at NAB in a hotel room with bad Wi-Fi, and it was like, holy cow. So, attaboy. I mean, great job. Great job. You know, I think part of that question, you know, Addy, is the idea of who, you know, if we always think about our audience as lean back viewers, well then, geez, you got to serve up content constantly. It's got to be there all the time. But I think the difference is that if we do that, it's the same mistake that cable companies are making today. They're looking at their current audience and thinking, we've got to serve our current audience, instead of thinking about tomorrow's audience, those millennials who, in our experience, are used to searching for content. They're used to digging a little bit different, digging a little bit harder. They're lean forward audiences. And so I think, again, it's evolving. You know, how hard is it? You know, I think you watch it, how many recommendations they take, you watch how many suggestions they follow, and you know, and when they go in a different direction, maybe that's just a spur of the moment thing. So you know, it's very interesting because the Netflix chief of content, Ted Sarandos, said that he was asked, well, you know, you guys are programming now using data constantly, right? He said, yeah, we are. But the most important data is, you know, basically him saying, yeah, I like that show, and we're going to do it this way. And I think that remains, and I think that's what you're speaking to as well. You know, you have data, but still, the cleanest data is, I hate to say this, seat of your pants, gut, you know, my instinct that says this is the right way.
Yeah.
So.
Maybe I'll put it a slightly different way. You know, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but let me just shift modes for a second. You know, how many people listen, you know, like have iTunes or something and listen to all of your music on shuffle? You know, a couple people do it. Not as many people as you would think do it. And one of the reasons is that, like, for example, you're sitting there and you hear a couple of great songs. You're like, oh yeah, that great song, oh that great song, and all of a sudden a Christmas song comes on. And you're like, why is a Christmas song coming on in July? So. Think about it for a second. You have a set of data, a set of assets that you've curated personally and said, like, this is my music, I love this stuff. I'm going to put it on my device, I'm going to buy it, presumably, and you know, keep all that stuff together. And I want you to sort of order it in the way that I might want to enjoy it. And even within that, you can miss by huge measure, even with all that data, even with all that curation. Like, you can't get any more personal than your set of music, and you could still screw it up. And so I think that, like, that just put, you know, when you start to abstract that and anonymize it, it just puts the challenge to, like, trying to figure out what somebody's going to want to watch at a given time on a given screen in a given context is really, really, really hard to do. And the algorithms are just not there. I mean, even though the data is starting to come in, the sort of AI that sits behind that is not even close to where it's going to have to be to even figure that out. And I think that leads to the fact that, you know, human intuition's pretty good.
Yep.
And people that are consistent about making hit shows obviously have a talent that we're not necessarily tapping into. And you know, I think the downside risk is also that, like, if you're 100% algorithmic and you remove that that human touch and let the computer decide it, you start to get into pandering, where, like, the computer is going to gravitate towards the mean, and then the first person that sort of does something dramatically different that's a departure is going to look, oh wow, look, they've just done this thing that's completely against this other tide. And so these things kind of ebb and flow, and they are related to context and they are related to human intuition. But what you can do is test out thesis. You can ask the right questions and say, like, look, I want to try this thing or this particular slant, and then see if it has the intended result. And if it doesn't, then you may want to switch gears, or it may have a result that you weren't expecting, but it may be better. But you can't just leave it to chance.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great piece. And I think one of the things that we see, you know, when I speak with broadcasters and, you know, publishers, is people say, well, we've got our metrics, and we know what we're supposed to be looking at. And I'm not talking about the macro level, whereby they're very much aligned against what the business objectives are, but really around the questions that they ask today. And part of that really is, you know, people have a set of reports. You know, we talk about, yes, we're in real-time data space, but people are effectively just saying, tell me how many people are watching that right now. What's the concurrency? So how have you, you know, in your experiences, learning or teaching the business to ask the right questions, right? Because I think one of the biggest things is it's not that the data's not there, like Joe mentioned earlier on. The real challenge is what are the right questions, and do you do it once and you're done? How iterative is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think part of it comes from where people are anchored. And so I suspect, in my experience, the folks that were sort of anchored for television that had a certain set of like metrics like Nielsen and ratings and these notions of it, like had a very specific lens on the world. And then when data starts to come that's outside of that lens, it becomes hard to deal with. I mean, I remember when Nielsen started to expand to the notion of C3, like when DVRs became a reality. And so there were tons of shows that were never, ever, ever popular when they were watched live, appointment viewing. But at the same time, you throw them on a DVR, and then you get hits like The Wire and some of these other shows that were really like breakthrough, or Mad Men, or a lot of the FX stuff. That they've had a pretty good run there. And so when you see that sort of stuff and you start to look at it, it's like, well, if you come from the live perspective, then this notion of what this DVR data doesn't even make any sense to you. And so it's hard to reconcile into programming. I think that the folks that we're now starting to see, these pure digital plays, are much more data reliant. Yeah. And the way that I sort of look at it from a business standpoint is, if I'm the person making this content decision, I look at it the same way I think of self-driving cars. I don't think I really want the car to drive for me, but I would like an assisted car. Like when I'm on the expressway, if I could just keep my, lean back a little bit and let it do most of the work. And I think that the data is that part of it. Is like there's an aspect of like trying to refine your job down to a set of possibilities using data, and then picking those possibilities using intuition and gut and feel, and really the stuff that still seems to be a bit intangible to us. But I think that the folks that come from that perspective of data-driven decision-making seem to be able to adopt it a lot more. A lot of the folks that you hear say that it'll never happen or won't happen are folks that come from a lens of having a more narrow data set, I think, and therefore having to make up the decision 80% by gut.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jim?
It's always great to go to a broadcaster convention and throw out the word Nielsen. Yeah. And the responses are
I'm always excited when I see
nice.
that. Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
I had nothing to add. I agree, 100%. Yeah. Sorry, I was just smiling along, saying that's exactly right.
Yeah, excellent. Well, let's switch gears a little bit to let's think about the audience. And we've heard earlier on that there isn't you've got different types of audiences. Whether you want to cut it by age, whether you want to cut it by interest, whether you want to cut it by all the other demographics. But let's switch gears, because I don't think it will be cricket if we didn't speak about millennials.
Yes.
So one of the interesting things I remember, looking at this, and I don't know if let's take a quick survey. How many people? We're thinking about what the typical attention span on a stream is for a millennial. How many people will say it is? And I know this is a generalization, because again, we can still cut this by multiple ways. But just go with the exercise. How many people will say it's 2 minutes? A show of hand for 2 minutes. Okay. A show of hand for 5 minutes. A few more hands for 5. A show of hands for 90 seconds. A few more hands. A show of hand for 15 seconds. Oh, I think you guys are a very smart audience, because I think that it's 90 seconds is the typical when we look at data and we look at this and we cut it by that particular demographic. And again, you've got to think about, you've got short form, you've got long form content. But it was just to kind of tease out how we're thinking about this. And if we think about advertising and the way ads are sold, video ads, we heard, I talked about, how much, 6.3 billion. Could it have been 8 billion? Should it be, where is the opportunity? And again, it's looking at those different groups. A lot of the formats today are typically 30 seconds when we think about ads. So I think it'll be right for me to start this with Jim, because I know you have a couple of millennials in your household. And tell me how they are different.
They are so different. First off, there was a great quote that last week came out of an earnings call. I won't say who said it, but it was the CEO of a cable company that recently had his deal busted. And he was on the being bought end. And he said that he's just so tired that, you know, we're just so obsessed with millennials. And my thought is, they're your future customers. Well, maybe he figures he'll get bought by somebody else, and they can worry about millennials. Because if you don't think about millennials, who are you thinking about? Who's the future business? So I have two sons. One is 24 and one is 26. They both graduated from college. They both are very chatty, just like Dad, chatty guys, pretty smart. And it's just amazing to watch them watch television, because I gave my youngest son a 36-inch cast-off, you know, flat panel that was really in great shape. And I went to his apartment. It was sitting against the wall, turned off, dust, clothing, all that kind of stuff hung over. And I said, "Don't you ever watch it?" He goes, "I play games on it sometimes." I said, "Well, what do you watch?" And he holds up his tablet. I went to his brother's apartment. I said, "Then what do you watch?" And he holds up his iPhone. And that is the difference. And these guys, I mean, they have good jobs, they have income. They chose not to get a cable subscription. They chose to go broadband.
They cut the cord?
They were never connected.
They never were a cord. They never saw it. You know, the only time they saw it was at my place. And generally when they were there, they were chatting with each other, texting back and forth, which is pretty amazing in itself. But I can remember going out to an NAB convention. I'm on an airplane. I desperately wanted to see the national championship game. And I'm texting back and forth with my son, what's the score? And he said, "Pop, here, just take this." And he sent me a pirate site to go to watch a bit of the game. And that's the difference. You know, they're willing to pay for content. They will buy content. But they also have my HBO login credentials, and I'm sure everyone does. You know, it's so.
Well, you gave it to me earlier on.
It.
So.
They probably did. So I mean, I think millennials are very willing to buy, but I think they're also just looking for a better experience, and that hasn't been delivered to them yet.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I remember when I had first come to NPR, and I was in the HR setup meetings, and I was the first group that they showed a video to, and it was an interview of 12 different NPR listeners, and they all happened to be between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 30. None of them, except for one out of the dozen, none of them knew that NPR was available on the radio. Which is astonishing. So to them, NPR is the website, it's apps, and even for them, it's not the connected cars, because they're not the folks that are necessarily buying these connected cars yet. They're getting there. It's really interesting because we've actually got a big push internally to make sure that we're also producing content that is geared not just towards our traditional demographic, but also geared towards millennials. And we've got editorial divisions that are really focusing heavily on millennials. And, you know, I think case in point, we're finding that, you know, and again, you know, traditional radio, it's difficult to measure anyway, but we're finding the consumption habits between the millennials and what was typically our normal demographic to be very, very different. And so we are paying very close attention to that. And thankfully for us, it's not just the metrics that we can crunch, but it's really also the fact that more and more the way that we're serving out the content is literally on a personalized basis. So even if we don't know much about you, even if we don't know your name or whether you're male or female, we're still recognizing that it's you and that you're coming back, and that we're trying to give you sort of that same, you know, machine/human curated, you know, content presentation.
Good, thank you. And Joe, I'll give that same question to you, and then one final thought from you in terms of OTT and TV everywhere.
Sure. Well, I'll give you two quick anecdotes about the data side of it. Years ago, probably 5-6 years ago, we had a new product person that was in that role, and we were starting to look at the data, and they were saying, you know, when people watch video on the homepage of MLB.com or Club.com, like Yankees.com, you know, they only watch for 12 seconds. So we should really start cutting 12-second highlights. And I'm not kidding. And so we did. We did a little A/B testing. We started to cut some 12-second highlights. And what we found out is 12 seconds is a crappy highlight. And so, you know, the data can only get you so far, and then you have to figure out the context. And so, you know, we talk about millennials, and we say, okay, well, they do this, they do that, they watch for 90 seconds. You know, these are averages. These are sort of things. But the content is what matters. And so I'll take another one of the folks that we've done some work for in the past is Vice Media. You know, these guys are kicking it down in Brooklyn. They're making incredible content. They're an absolute rocket ship of a content provider, and their demographic are millennials. But if you take down an episode of Vice on HBO, let's just say, 45-minute, hour-long episode, they are crushing it with effectively their generation's version of 60 Minutes. I mean, that's what it is, right? It's investigative journalism where they're going out and they're doing incredible work as reporters and reporting on things all across the world, and millennials are gobbing it up with spoons, like, because they love it. So sometimes it's not just the fact that it's long or short, it's what is the content and how are you making it and does it resonate with them? And so, you know, you have to sort of look intrinsically. And you know, my final thought about OTT and things like that is that's where, you know, there are preferences, like folks that are cord never connectors, folks that like to work on these devices, which is one of the reasons, you know, we're doing something called StatCast now, which is essentially player tracking, where we're actually getting real detailed real-time or near real-time metrics about acceleration and route efficiency and things like that. And when we did an experiment, not really an experiment, we rolled this out, you know, a couple of weeks ago in Washington, and on MLB Network, our television channel, we really used this stuff. It was all over the place. And the funniest thing was, same baseball game, still Bob Costas in the booth, you know, still calling the game. But the group of folks that were most excited about it were the millennials. So it was the presentation of that game. Right. And the ability to actually service them. You can have it all. You can, you know, if you're smart and you're good content to your OTT TVE side of it, there will be some content that's great on television. You know, baseball lives and breathes with our television partners. That's a huge part of what we do. But we can also have some OTT, and we can also have some TVE, and we may actually have multiple versions of that feed on OTT, so that we can give people what it is that they're looking for. So I actually contend that while there's no question millennials can multitask and things like that, they just have different tastes. Mm-hmm. And I think when you give them the content that they want, you really see the stickiness, and to your point, people will pay for it. Yep. And they'll appreciate it. And they're just like any other customer. Give them value, speak to them in a way that's meaningful, and they'll be your customer.
That's great. So we're running out of time. So what I have a final piece, which is around content and the customer, right? Is there king of the hill, king and queen? How are they?
Oh yeah.
And so let's take 20 seconds, and we'll start with you, Jim.
Customer is king. Content is overrated. I mean, content is critical, but customer is driving where we're going. Customer has decided we're going to be over the top. Customer has decided we're going to show you. I'm going to watch this on mobile video. Customer has decided when they want to watch it, where they want to watch it, how they want to watch it.
Mike?
I think to build off of what Jim is saying, it's not just the customer, but it's also, in some cases, advertising that ends up being kind of king over content, and a lot of the advertising seems to drive content and content creation.
Wow.
I'll pivot. I'm going to go with a different analogy. It's a snake eating its own tail. The customer is the head of the snake. The tail is the content. You have to have both, otherwise the snake goes hungry. And at the same time, if you're the tail, it doesn't really do too much if you don't have a head associated with it. And so I think that that symbiotic relationship is exactly what it is. You have to have both in order to have a successful business and a successful fan.
Excellent. I think those are great thoughts, and want to thank the panelists. But before we close this session, I want to see if there are any pertinent questions from the audience. So we don't have a mic to go around, I believe, but I will repeat your question. I'll start with you.
I speak loud. I'm curious from a very general point of view how the breakdown between the platforms are in terms of either eyes or minutes from mobile, desktop, a media server, and smart TV. I'm especially curious as to whether or not the amount of consumption for smart TV is more or less than you actually expected.
Well, we're on about 400 different platforms. What I can say is that the web continues to grow. You know, 5 years ago, the web was the entire pie. That size of the pie, the volume of that pie, is still continuing to grow. Yeah. The other two wedges that have sprouted out of it are mobile and connected devices. Yeah. And so smart TV is like sort of a subset of connected devices. I don't personally in North America see that being all that impactful. In other parts of the world, maybe a little bit more. But the Rokus, the Apple TVs, the stuff that you sort of connect to it, the consoles for millennials to the point there, that's the stuff that's right there. And so at this point in time, between mobile and connected devices, that is the majority. Like we've crossed the 50% line onto that. And if you look at like data traffic on the website, you know, we put out press releases. A couple of years ago, we crossed the 50% mark where most of the traffic was actually coming from mobile from a web standpoint. not necessarily a media standpoint, from a web standpoint. So it's all there. The good thing is the pies keep getting bigger.
And I think the thing that obviously contributes to that, one is the screen sizes are getting bigger, right? And the connectivity aspect to it.
Okay.
Absolutely. Just 2 years ago, we do a quarterly video index where we look at how much of our traffic is coming from where. And 2 years ago, 4% of our traffic of our video plays were mobile, just 2.5 years ago. This quarter coming up, it's 42, 43%. And it's just, the volume of traffic and the rate of growth is phenomenal.
Great, thank you. We'll take a couple more questions. I saw this hand here, and then we'll go to the back.
Okay, you mentioned 90 seconds average for millennials, but that's not just 90 seconds. There are people who are just shopping, browsing. There are people who are looking for a great experience, and then they find it, and it becomes 15 minutes. So how do you guys break down and look at individual behaviors to ask people, small data, what the actual behavior is behind the numbers?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'll touch on that, and then I'll see if. So when we talk about 90 seconds, for instance, it's not necessarily that. And I think that was your point about you can't just decide you're going to chunk the content at 12 seconds. That's not going to get you what you want. It's about their attention span. So when you have really good content, and as you could see in that scenario, and this is why content is as important, I agree, as the users. So it's very important to understand that if you do not keep them engaged, so the content is a big part of that. In other words, it doesn't mean that 90 seconds of a great show, they're just going to bounce and they're all of a sudden they're texting. That's not really what that is telling us. It's just that their tolerance level, as it relates to whether it's quality of service or whether it's the type of content, is that much more different than the different groups.
Yeah, I mean, histograms are a big part of what you're asking too. So it's not just looking at the average or the mean or the median. It's actually looking at really what the histogram is of browsing and how much completion rate. So if you see a bunch of stuff that pulls that average down, you can start to see user journeys of this particular person, because you can still cluster them in the big data model where you're like, this person snack, found something they liked, went on. This person snack, didn't find anything, left the site, and things like that. And so we look at those much more from a histogram way of trying to figure out how did they get there, why did they get there, and did they stick once they found the thing they wanted.
Yeah. We're all out of time, but I did promise the gentleman in the back, so we'll take that question, then we'll wrap up. So the question is, are we able to connect to new audiences, capture new audiences, or is this typically your bread and butter, your existing audiences? And I'm going to pass that. Anybody in particular like to take that question?
So I think we're finding that a lot of the new platforms isn't necessarily cannibalizing existing audience. We're also, at least in the long run, looking to be able to extend our experience across platforms, so that as folks are maybe moving from the car into the living room, you're able to continue with that experience. But we're not finding that it's cannibalizing.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting, Addie, is that you're seeing an increase in the amount of time that people are actually spending with video. Yep. I mean, TV time, it's slipping a little bit, that actual TV time, but the rest of it, all the other devices, it's added up considerably higher.
Agree. So video clearly is one of the big drivers behind big data and audiences, engagement, and how much time people are spending. I'd like you to join me in thanking our esteemed panel. Thank you very much all for your time. One or two of the others will still be here, but we have to more or less make way for the next session. Thank you.